Yeah, it's the only real insta-kill in the entire game, but falling down... Wait a minute, roll it back a bit. Stop right there. If it's quote-unquote a bottomless pit, then how the heck did I just hit the bottom? The Kroz games. It's about time I got around to these, considering how massive of an influence they've had. Not so much on gaming as a whole, but on the successes of specific things. Kroz was basically the game that started ADG software, and game creation systems like ZZT and Megazooks directly followed in its footsteps. To put it simply, Kroz is pretty much as addictive as an action-based text mode game can get. There's actually a few reasons why these games are as addictive as they are. Firstly, there's a massive amount of content. All 7 main Kroz games combined equate to over 200 levels of action, half of which are randomly generated, the other half of which are handcrafted with all sorts of puzzles and traps to overcome. Secondly, these games are not a cakewalk, and in fact, a lot of your progress is going to depend on your patience, since every gem, every whip, every teleport, every key, everything you pick up needs to be hoarded and saved for just the right moments, because it's very possible to end up in a situation where you just can't progress because you screwed yourself over somehow. While situations like these would normally make a game bad, you're able to save your game at the start of every level, so it's not really that big a deal. These games also continually give you new obstacles and mechanics to work with without becoming overly complicated. And unlike some games which have terrible PC speaker sound effects, the ones in these games actually work really well. And Shrine of Kroz, the only Kroz game I had as a kid, was one of the few games I had back then that I'd play with the sound effects on. These games may not have aged well graphically, but they're still just as fun to play now as they were 2 decades ago. All of the Kroz games were developed by Scott Miller and published through his then new company called ADG between 1988 and 1990. They're all one-player action games, and while these games do have a number of puzzle elements, really, they're all 3 parts action and 1 part puzzle, so I'm hesitant to call them action/puzzle games. They each run in an 80x25 text mode, either 16 color or monochrome, and have PC speaker sound effects. As for the current release date, in 2009, all of the Kroz games were made freeware and can be obtained, including source code, from the 3D Realms website at www.3drealms.com. Yeah, we seriously need to talk about this. People new to the Kroz series, and even some Kroz veterans, can easily get confused with the way these games have been named. So let's boil this down so that you know what order to play the Kroz games in for the best overall experience, and which ones you can simply pass on because they're older versions. The 7 main Kroz games in their preferred play order include Caverns of Kroz 2, Dungeons of Kroz 2, Kingdom of Kroz 2, Return to Kroz, Temple of Kroz, Final Crusade of Kroz, and Lost Adventures of Kroz. While this is the order you should play them in, this is not the order they were released in, and in fact, some of these are updated versions of older titles. Kingdom of Kroz was the very first Kroz game, and in fact has some different levels than the updated Kingdom of Kroz 2. However, because it was the first Kroz game ever made, its control and timing systems weren't quite perfected yet, making it difficult to play for all the wrong reasons compared to every other Kroz game. The next Kroz game released was Dungeons of Kroz, which of course was later updated to Dungeons of Kroz 2. The third game released was Caverns of Kroz, which became the first game players were encouraged to play once updated to Caverns of Kroz 2. Return to Kroz actually had 2 previous releases, first named Castle of Kroz, then renamed Shrine of Kroz, before eventually settling on Return to Kroz. Temple of Kroz theoretically had an alias of Valley of Kroz, but there's next to no factual information anywhere about how this name came about, and none of the games or even the source code to the games make mention of this name. The Final Crusade of Kroz and Lost Adventures of Kroz are pretty much the only 2 games where there were no extra releases or names associated with them. The Lost Adventures of Kroz actually makes reference to a game called The Underground Empire of Kroz, but this game was cancelled and never saw the light of day. So there you go. Play through all the games on the left and you'll have played through pretty much every piece of Kroz content, save for maybe a few levels from the original Kingdom of Kroz, but again, that specific Kroz game has control and timing issues the other Kroz games don't have, so it may not be worth the aggravation. The Kroz games are played from an overhead perspective, much the same way Rogue was. But where Rogue was a move-based game where stuff didn't move until you did, the Kroz games are action games, meaning if you just sit around and do nothing, the enemies will still move around and the world will still update itself as needed. This means you gotta act fast and smartly in order to survive. You move around using the numeric keypad and can move in 8 different directions, with diagonal movement being extremely important for some of the traps and obstacles you'll encounter. Your main form of attack are whips. Each time you use a whip, it will swing around your character and hit everything immediately next to you. This can include breakable walls, tall grass, trees, enemies, even items that are getting in the way. However, you're going to quickly find out that because of the limited number of whips these games give you, it's actually better to conserve your whips and to only use them when you have no other choice, or when it would cost a massive number of gems to get through a section safely. Gems are kinda like your health. They're special magical gems that can disintegrate enemies and other dangers, with the amount of gems consumed based on how hazardous something is. The slow red enemies take away a single gem, the medium speed green enemies take away 2 gems, and the fast blue enemies take away 3 gems. If an enemy touches you when you have no gems to disintegrate them with, you die. Whipping enemies out of existence is an option too, but this leads into one of the key aspects of successfully getting through any of the Kroz games. Do you consume your whips or your gems? Typically, early in any of the Kroz games, losing a few gems isn't too big a deal. It's the later levels, when you have a decent stock of whips, that you'll want to start conserving your gems more. You also have to consider the difficulty of reaching certain item caches. I mean, if you see a stockpile of 6 chests, you're probably going to want to go grab them. But if you need to burn 30 whips to get there, then considering chests can only give you 2 to 4 whips each, you'll have suffered a net loss of whips no matter what. Or let's say you see a stock of 15 gems guarded by 8 green enemies. You lose 16 gems plowing through them, and thus would have a net loss of 1 gem once you grab them all. This leads into a particular mechanic these games have that's really important. If an enemy makes contact with a breakable wall, it not only breaks down the wall, but the enemy dies in the process. By taking advantage of this mechanic, you can not only conserve your whips, but get access to areas that would otherwise seem impossible to get into. The only catch is that enemies can destroy items as well, including keys, which are typically very necessary for beating the levels. So while luring enemies around to get them to run into breakable walls will really help you out, that same mechanic can also backfire depending on how a level is laid out. In a strange way, playing Kroz isn't just about controlling your character, but controlling the enemies around you as well, since the enemies have a very basic algorithm of just running straight towards you, and many levels require you to take advantage of this to succeed. Occasionally though, you may face levels where certain groups of enemies don't move until they're triggered by the player moving into a certain spot. Typically speaking though, unless you know exactly what you want to do, it's probably best to just leave the game paused so you can assess the situation. There's a couple other items too you want to keep your eyes open for. Teleporters and power rings. The teleporters basically let you teleport to a random spot on the current level when used, thus letting you get out of nasty situations or intentionally get yourself into certain situations. And some maps actually have certain areas that can only be accessed by a very lucky teleportation. Power rings, on the other hand, make your whip stronger, thus increasing the chance of smashing down breakable walls when you hit them. For some odd reason though, every even-numbered ring you pick up doesn't actually get indicated by the whips counter, though I'm pretty sure they still have an effect all the same. The Kroz games aren't as difficult as Rogue, but that's not to say they're easy, so I have a number of tips to help you guys out. My first major tip is to save your game routinely, but not necessarily at the start of a level. I never really caught on to this until I tested it out after recording the game footage, but when you save your game, it doesn't save your progress on the current level, just the state the game was in when you actually entered that level. So even if you're about to die, what you can do is save your game right then and there, reload it immediately, and you'll restart that level in the same state you entered it in. So typically, the best time to save your game is near death when you're sure you haven't royally screwed up by missing something in an earlier level, since on rare occasions you may actually need keys from one level to get past another. Now speaking of the keys, this is something that Kroz games usually give you some extras of, so long as you take advantage of certain quirks of some of the level layouts. Having extra keys is good, but typically you want to avoid using them unless you absolutely have to, especially considering extra keys are worth a ton of points if you can end the game with them. My next tip is to whip the question marks. Now, every so often when you enter a level, some of the items will show up as question marks as opposed to what they actually are. If you whip such an item, it'll take on its normal appearance so that you can see what it is. The drawback is that some specific kinds of items can get destroyed this way, though most of the time when this happens, you probably wouldn't have wanted to pick it up anyways. If, however, when you whip a question mark, it stays being a question mark, that can only mean one of two things. Either it'll trigger a major trap of some kind, or it'll be a pouch containing a large number of gems. In these events, trial and error is pretty much the only way you'll figure out what they actually do. Now speaking of trial and error, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the levels can put you into a situation where you don't exactly die, but you can't exactly proceed any further either. When this happens, you can restart the level simply by saving and restoring, though that might not help you if you needed keys from a previous level. My next tip is to be smart about where you use your whips. For instance, if you want to get an item that's behind some breakable walls, consider how many different breakable walls could be broken to get the item you want, and put yourself in a position to hit as many of those walls as you can with a single whip, thus increasing the chances that one of those walls will break and give you access to the item. Conservation and hoarding is the key to success in these games. My final tip is to leave no stone unturned. Because of the way saving and loading works, you can essentially replay levels as much as you want until you've perfected them and can move on from there. So try everything out that you don't recognize, and if you feel you can do better, save, reload, and try again. The Kroz games are about as good looking as a text mode game can get. So they're kinda ugly and horribly outdated in the graphical department. But that's also part of their charm, and even if you have to sort of imagine the actual look of everything, the gameplay is still here and still as fun today as it was when these games were brand new. As such, I recommend everyone with an interest in DOS games to give the Kroz series a try, and since they're all freeware now, there's no excuse not to. Setting up DOSBox to run any of the Kroz games simply requires you to set a very low fixed cycles count. I recommend a setting of 400, and in the games themselves, I recommend setting the CPU speed to fast, at least when the game actually has this option. The really early Kroz games, like the original Kingdom of Kroz, will probably require even fewer cycles to keep from going too fast. Plus, you can adjust this setting to make the game slower or faster as desired. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. I was considering doing ZZT next week, but because of the massive scope of that thing, I'm not really ready to do a review of it. So instead, I decided to go with something incredibly obscure. Unless you were one of the very few people with a modem in the late 80s. And if you think you know which game that could be, then send your guess to adg@pixelships.com and tune in next Saturday to see what I've got in store. By the way, something I found rather amusing. Guess who was one of the guys producing games for Key Punch Software?